So before we talked about the Pythagorean theorem, and the Pythagorean theorem, as a reminder, is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And what we talked about when we talked about the Pythagorean theorem is that it only works for right triangles. And so let's say this triangle is a right triangle, and we know it's a right triangle because I'm going to put that little box in the corner indicating that it has a right angle. So if we know that it's a right triangle and we know two of the sides, like let's say this one is 13 and this one is 5, if we know two sides of the right triangle, we can figure out the third side simply by setting up the Pythagorean theorem. And as you remember before, the important side is the C, the hypotenuse. And the hypotenuse is always across from the right angle, and it's always the longest side. So in this case, our hypotenuse is 13, and then it doesn't matter which one is x and which one is 5. A and b don't matter. And then we would continue to solve. But what the converse of the Pythagorean theorem says is if we don't know whether or not it's a right triangle, but we do know all of the sides, so let's do 6, 8, and 10. So in this case, I know all the sides. What I don't know is it a right triangle or not? And to figure it out, we're going to use the converse of the Pythagorean theorem. So we're going to set up the Pythagorean theorem just like we did before, but this time we know all of the sides. And again, your C is going to be whatever your longest side is. So in this case, it's 10. And then we continue to solve it. So 6 squared is 36, 8 squared is 64, 10 squared is 100. If I take 36 plus 64, I get 100. And so because at the very end, 100 does equal 100, this means that because the Pythagorean theorem worked, it is in fact a right triangle. But let's say the sides are 4, 12, and 13. So we're going to set up the Pythagorean theorem again. This time our C is 13 because it's the longest side. And we're going to solve this. So 16 plus 144 equals 169. When I take 16 plus 144, I get 160. But when I get to this bottom step, 160 does not equal 169. So that means this is not a right triangle. So what the converse of the Pythagorean theorem says is if the Pythagorean theorem works, it is a right triangle. But if the Pythagorean theorem doesn't work, then it's not a right triangle.